Welcome to Dig Deep with Dr. Yolie, where we explore the questions, stories, and experiences that shape who we are and who we are becoming. I'm Dr. Yolanda Sealey-Ruiz. Let's dig in. I could not be more delighted today for this episode, in this moment, after having been in a beautiful conversation with this individual, Dr. Dia Joy Wright. I'm coming into this podcast today, y'all. I'm not even going to read a poem. Usually there's a poem that's read at the beginning, but I said to myself, no, I need to jump right in to this moment. But I do want to talk about a discovery and a connection to this beautiful person, mind, human being that you're about to hear from. When I began thinking about this idea of archaeology of self, of course, my first question was, where are the Black archaeologists? And I wondered if the Black archaeologists felt as marginalized as Black teachers, as marginalized as Black healthcare physicians and nurses, and those of us in various fields. And I felt so grateful to come across the Society of Black Archaeologists. So I wanted to put that right there for a moment. And then, about maybe 2 years later, I have the great fortune to speak to Dr. Dia Joy Wright for an event that I was part of. And on our conversation, which was supposed to last, I don't know how many minutes, maybe a half an hour to handle the logistics, 30 minutes, went for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. And I found out not only is he an anthropologist and a sociologist, everything that he was saying reminded me of what it meant for me to sit in meetings and watch videos of the Society of Black Archaeologists. And so welcome, 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 Dr. Dia Joy Wright. And thank you for activating in me this idea of Black archaeology that could be so central to what it is that I do, as much as the Society of Black Archaeologists. And for that, I honor your wisdom, and I thank you for being here with Dig Deep with Dr. Yolie.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and just to be continuously in connection and community with you. You're a wonderful spirit. So I'm so happy to go back and forth with you today.
Thank you. And if I may, I'd like to give proper honors and read a bit about Dr. Dia Joy Wright. So I'm going to turn to their bio. Dr. Dia Joy Wright is an interdisciplinary Black queer feminist scholar, poet, and sociocultural and educational anthropologist, writing about, experiencing, researching, and exploring transformative racial justice, educational equity, and liberative social embodiment and practice. Their work is dedicated to exploring educational liberation practices for underrepresented and underserved QT plus BIPOC populations through addressing the many ways structures of oppression map onto the everyday lives and bodies of those communities through interdisciplinary, culturally specific, creative, and socially reflective educational methodologies, policies, and practices. Dr. Joy Wright believes that liberation is collective, and as such, we must get free by radically freedom dreaming, radically reimagining, radically loving, and radically enacting justice with those at the margins of society. And with that, I'm going to just open up this space by asking you what's on your heart, what's on your mind, and how are you entering the podcast at this moment?
Thank you for having me again. What's on my heart, what's on my mind. I'm just excited to get into this with you. I've known of your work for years now, right? But in hearing about this book and it's about to release and getting to see a bit of the work before, I'm just excited to quite literally dig deeper with you in some of this. And it's a delight to me. Initially, when you hear of scholars outside of the larger field of anthropology and they pull in the concepts, right? It's not always the same communal connection, right? You connected with the Society of Black Anthropologists, Black archaeologists. You connected with that work. It wasn't just using a term, it was trying to understand how that positionality, how that felt from the vantage point of that work. So it's always exciting to see when people really dig deep into the anthropological and archaeological aspect of everything. And in general, I'm sitting in, when we last spoke, maybe a couple weeks ago, in this space of what does it mean to really be in alignment, right? What does it mean to be at the place that you're supposed to be, but to recognize that at the same time? We sometimes arrive at a place, but we don't recognize that we're there, so then we miss a train, right? So, what does it mean to really be aware within all of this? And I think it connects a lot to the kind of self-social historical awareness that you talk about in your work as well.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. And we're going to jump in because literally I have 100 questions. Well,
Okay, let's go.
my first question is, when you hear this idea that I'm taking up, the archaeological approach to teaching, and in some ways you just make some
Mhm.
reference to it, what's the first memory, the first learning experience or community story that comes up for you? In other words, kind of what's your first dig site where you realize that education could either harm or liberate?
Okay. That is an excellent question, and you hit me with dig site. All right, I love this. Let me see. So I will do the liberation space first. I remember I was in fourth grade, and sometimes there are memories of us in childhood that we just are out of the window somewhere else. Most of my childhood is like that. But in fourth grade, I had this teacher, and this white lady, Miss Waldrop, but she noticed that I really, really liked to read, right? That I was just like devouring every book in our little fourth grade room library in Birmingham, Alabama. And she handed me a book of poetry. And she was like, I think you'd enjoy this. He's one of my favorite poets. And it was Edgar Allan Poe, right? This very like dark, very a lot of ways sad, but very good work, white man from what is it, the 1800s or something. She handed me this book, and it was a collected works, and I just kind of devoured it. And then I went down and took in every other short story, every poem that I could within understanding his work. The moment of that, it's a teacher giving a student a book, right? But I think what was most liberating is that she noticed something in me, right? It wasn't just let me give this child a book because they like to read it. I'm going to give this kid a poetry book because I see something that's about that. And that spawned for me this understanding of how do I take what's already in my brain, because I had already thought in a poetic manner. You know, how I spoke was already like that. When you blacken from the South, the poetry and the way of speaking just kind of merges in and outside of itself, right? So it was already there. And she gave me that, and it really became a catalyst to how I would go on to learn how to describe things, how I would go on to learn how to articulate my life in a way that may be further away from Edgar Allan Poe in the way that he navigated, obviously. But it was a really beautiful moment that I've never forgotten. I don't have the book anymore, but I had it for a very long time, and I lost it in a move. But it was like one of those like almost Northern anthology
Yes.
collections of it. And I remember that because Wright, in the same month, I believe, I was at a thrift store and I got a book of like Civil War poetry from both sides of the Civil War
Hmm.
that was navigating that. And it was poetry. Again, it's not lost on me that the poetry that I got first at 9 years old was poetry that was surrounding grief, right? That was surrounding death and transformation. That's all Edgar Allan Poe's work is about. That's what the Civil War poetry was about, right? And really taking that in and having that come both from an outside of education space, but in the education space, that felt liberative in the moment, though I wouldn't have had the language to call it that. But it felt like that, especially looking back. So I think that is where education really helped. It's those moments. Right? I don't know what my trajectory would have looked like had I not been handed that book. I don't know that I would have went and found Edgar Allan Poe by myself. But that led me to find and to go searching. Right? That led me on a journey that I had a lot of agency in figuring out who and how poetry was connected to me, which led me to spoken word, which eventually led me to anthropology and theater, right? It all led me to now. To answer the question, that is a very liberative in the kind of space of it.
So much, I want to say, and we'll get to a point, I hope, and having you really talk about a specific term, necrovatic divination. I hope I
Hmm.
pronounced it right.
Yeah,
I just seen that connection. But true story, Edgar Allan Poe's true story. My father is named after Edgar Allan Poe.
I love that.
He has passed on, but his name was Edgar Allan Sealey, same spelling, different
Mm.
last name. And as a result of that, I too grew up reading Edgar Allan Poe.
Look at us. I love
Another
that.
connection. But you know what? Before we go forward, I want to go back and I really want you to talk a little bit about your work from your identity standpoint, right? So you describe
Mhm.
yourself as a Black queer feminist, scholar, poet, and sociocultural educational anthropologist. So, how do those identities shape what you notice first in your learning or in the learning space? And what you consider as a worthy artifact, or what I call artifact, to focus on.
Thank you for that. I think for me, Black, queer, feminist, non-binary, I sit at the intersection of so many things, right? In the traditional intersectionality sense of like intersecting oppressions, but also at the intersection of a lot of beautiful spaces. As a person who's just always in the middle and around and outside of, I get to always be thinking in the vantage point of multiplicity, right? Being able to see so many different ways of who and how I could be, where I am, and how work or a field or methodologies or anything like that can apply or not apply, right? I've never felt locked in to anything, hence probably why much later I'm like, oh, the non-binary, that makes sense in how I understand not just gender, but how I understand life, right? And for me, I have always been all of those things all at once, even without language and navigating that. But I can't not be Black and queer, right? My Black is queer, my queer is Black, right? I think very visually and metaphorically, so you can walk with me a little bit.
Yeah.
But, some people, they look at a star map of the universe and they focus only on Earth, right? Just that singular planet. I see all of it. And my brain has always been in seeing not just the universe we're in, but the multiple galaxies that we can be. And it made sense why anthropology was the best kind of like directional field for me to go to because I don't think I could have served. My brain couldn't have survived in a different like space that had me narrowed down so small. Because of that, I'm really able to see these connections and synthesize like how things apply. Even though I'm an anthropologist, even though I'm performance studies scholar, I don't rightly fit
Right.
in anything but the interdisciplinary because I can't help but bring all of that in. I'm an anthropologist and performance studies scholar, but poetry is always there. Poetry undergirds everything
Mm.
too, right? So my writing is that. The way that I move about life is that. And as far as like a worthy artifact of study or a worthy artifact to navigate and negotiate around, I see it as always being influenced by poetry in a way that it's this kind of care for the emotional like logic of how we move in life. Who is more worthy of this kind of research than the people like us, right? Than Black folks and Black queer folks and folks who have been in need of this kind of restoring, counterstoring, this like narrative control and an excavation of lives otherwise is how I think of it, especially in the work that I do, which we'll get to later. But particularly around like folks who have passed who don't get the opportunity to retell their stories themselves or to counter the narratives about their things themselves.
I'd like to actually jump into that if that
Hmm.
these questions had the intent of trying to pack in as much as possible because of the way you traverse landscapes in the world, right? What does an arts-based dig do or offer or afford? So, in other words, how do poems and movements and stories and multimodal work, how does this surface what traditional teaching hides, in some case, maybe erases? And this concept of necrographic divination, Take us through that and then tell us really, what do the arts offer in
Mm,
teaching? Other traditional models of teaching just can't measure up.
thank you. So with necrographic divination, it was a labor of grief and love. I developed the concept back in 2020, so in the midst of lockdown and the pandemic, but also in the midst of that particular summer, right? Which is the summer of the Breonna Taylors, the George Floyds, the Philando Castiles, all of those. And this came from that. It first came from grief, and then it found its way into understanding that that was also a part of the love. And for me, necrographic divination is basically, in the more scientific sense, is a method of qualitative content analysis that then is mixed together with poetic methodologies of a kind of dialectical poetic way of counterstorying.
Mhm.
So what I did was, every black person who died as a result of anti-black, anti-queer violence, or police brutality from 2012 on, starting with Trayvon Martin, from 2012 on to, at that point, 2020. Though as I continued a little bit further after that, so about 2022, I went in and I interviewed them.
Mhm.
I did the spiritual process of necromancy, which is the talking to the dead to divine something about how we live. And I interviewed them, which means qualitative content analysis. I went in and I looked through every single thing that was ever written about them that I could find online, whether they wrote it about themselves, whether their families wrote it about them, or whether the media wrote it about them. And oftentimes, what the media writes about Black people who die is very different than what anybody else has to say about them.
That's right.
I ask questions of like, how would you have liked to be, right? How would you have liked to live? What did you want to do? Who would you have wanted to be if you were able to, if your life wasn't foreclosed? And going through that and seeing, what I came about was a way to, how do I help to give space to these folks who have passed, these now ancestors, untimely ancestors as I call them, but how do I give space to them to be able to live the most quotidian everyday life possible, because most of them were killed in quotidian activity. Oftentimes, Black people, we lose our lives. We're killed by doing the quotidian, because somehow that's dangerous. Somehow dancing is dangerous. Somehow playing with water guns as kids are dangerous. Somehow, just being at a cookout is dangerous. So, in part of this work, I use poetry to basically breathe life into trans-dimensional space so that they can then live. And poetry to me is emotional logic rendered, right? I'm giving emotional logic, or language around emotional logic, into a framework around this counter storying as a way to counter these narratives that are devoid of emotion, right? That are devoid of love, really. So it's really, for me, like a way to honor those who have passed by showing and telling something differently about their lives. For example, I wouldn't have known, had I not done the work, who Philando Castile was, besides the person who got shot in the car with his daughter and his partner in the back. But what I learned is that not only did he work in school nutrition in a lunchroom, but he wanted to be a youth nutritionist. He was going on that project to become that. And imagine what he could have done had he were still alive, what goals he could have reached in the ways that he wanted to, right, were he still alive. There are many people who have died who wanted to have different lives, who wanted to become different types of people, who were on their pathways to do that. And then some who had had many stories, like George Floyd. He had so many different transitions and transformations in his own life. And he was back at a point where he had made it through
Yes.
some more darkness that had come up. And unfortunately, his life was foreclosed around that point too. So he didn't get to maybe take another step toward that light and navigating that. Or we have folks who are, many of our queer Black folks who were killed based on who they were, and because they just wanted to exist and exist freely, as many of us do. The importance of like poetry, to kind of round out the long form question, because I'm long winded,
Mhm.
but the importance of like poetry in this social scientific sense, the importance of poetry rounds out our stories by giving life back to us in a space that has removed and elided that life from us in the first place. a space of social science that has made clinical, like black bodies clinical and black bodies only bodies, right? Especially in anthropology. Anthropology is responsible for a lot of the horrific, advancements in science and social science and medical. That is one of the oldest fields that we have. And quite literally, it is a field where we are working on that, right? Rethinking that whole space. How do I engage with methods of inquiry as we think of anthropology, but I do it in a way that doesn't talk just about people, doesn't make myself a third person omniscient observer, but it puts me in a place where I'm practicing medium. I am letting folks come into my body, inhabit, and tell me what they want, how they would have wanted to be, and how much I'm learning from that, right? It's been a part of how much can we learn from all of the possibilities that these folks could have had and may very well have in some other transdimensional reality,
Right.
right?
Right.
How much can we learn from that about how to live for us
Mm.
as Black people? What can we learn from death about life? And that was this whole space because we had gotten so much of it, and we still always get so much of it. And in my life, I have had so much death, and I'm like, I might as well learn something. So then, how do I re-navigate this? And again, to do that in a field that is traditionally so devoid of love in life, that makes the individuals we talk about not interlocutors but subjects, was all that I knew how to do, right? It was the only way I knew how to navigate a field like that, which is to breathe life back into. And again, it's not me as like the ultimate, I get to create life in that way. It's like, no, that whole process, it's hard. It was very difficult, which is why I don't do it as often as I did anymore. But that entire process was years long of me taking in the lives of other people and then synthesizing and refunneling it out into something else. So it's a constant open channel of grief and then love and grief and then love routed through my body consistently. And that was my way of honoring and renegotiating and navigating that. When people think about poetry and the arts, right, within this whole context, the arts can do a thing that other spaces can't, which arts help us learn how to live and learn how to be and learn how to emote, right, in ways that we otherwise couldn't or felt like we couldn't in traditional society. Again, I'm a performance studies scholar. I'm a physical theater artist, right? So everything is about embodiment for me, and that is a part of this work too, where I'm thinking about how is my body, my embodiment, different or not from these people in the moments of their death or throughout their lives, so that way, right? I like walking too. Trayvon is only a couple of days older than me, you know, so that could have been me in Florida and Alabama, right? It could have been the same thing, and there's a lot of these possibilities and embodiment of what could have been. And art teaches us about the could have been, the maybes, the maybe nots, and all of those spaces. And what happens when we take that, what I call like an arts based collaboration method, into the rest of the work that we do? We give so much more life and so much more color and so much more sound to what we're doing. And we honor people in making work that is with people, not just about them. Yeah.
Wow. I do just want to take a moment to sit with all of that. Everything you shared is so profound and so brilliant. It's important for me and those who are listening and watching just to take a moment to the invitation that we just received. Because what I took from it was an invitation to live more fully. As you talked about grief,
Mhm.
and as you talked about transitions, what one would call that. So I just want to take a quick moment, a few seconds. Thank you for your brilliant. I have so many questions. I have those that I have written, but the one that's coming up for me now is, and where is this taking you next? Because I'm thinking about the power, and I almost want to use the word sacrifice in some ways. I don't think that would be your word, but the sacrifice of opening your body, your emotions to, yes, the love and the beauty of their lives and what their lives could have been, but also the sadness and the violence and the way, as you say, their lives were foreclosed. So I have one question first is, how did you manage that? Did you have a spiritual practice? Were you in therapy? How did you manage while you were navigating and in some ways being a channel, I would say, and
Mhm.
doing that work and stepping away from it? Where are you now with that work and how has it changed you?
Yeah, thank you for that. I did not manage it well while it was happening, and part of that is because I was in survival mode myself. But for me, I'm the type of person that I have to understand something or try to understand it if it's affecting me such that. And in this kind of work, I needed to fully understand as much as I could why we were getting killed, why this was allowed to happen, why this was so accepted and continuously happening, and why our stories weren't there. While this is the methodology I have, my specialty is in the afterlives of enslavement and how they affect society and individual like habitats and how we live. So in the United States, there's everything from enslavement onward and how all of those things are in there, hence
Work
educational
at the
anthropology.
apartment, the work of Christina Sharp and so many other.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly. And really sitting in that space. And it was a survival tactic. I kept in this work because that's how I was able to excise my own darkness, right? To excise my own space. It was taking in the grief and the death and the pain, but all to learn something about the love, life, and the joy, right?
Mm.
And in every case, I learned something because in every single case of these hundreds of people, from that time that died, more than hundreds, right? And I learned something from everyone about joy because there was always somebody who knew them, somebody who talked about them in a way. And if there weren't, there was space to then give them what I could not find about them, right? In a time where, again, like I said, this work started when we were in lockdown. And I'm immunocompromised. So I had to be in lockdown in a very particular way. There was ways that I was already afraid of my life. If I'm walking outside and a policeman can see me and shoot me, well, the air could also kill me too because COVID is in there, right? But that didn't deter me from walking, right? I lived in DC at the time, which is its own fun little thing. But I would walk from my place all the way to the Martin Luther King Monument. It was my daily walk. It's like a 3-hour walk back and forth from where I was all the way to there. And it was my own pilgrimage and trek, but it was my defiant way of saying, because even though my life is on the line, I'm still going to be out here. So now that I think about it, I think that was my practice.
Okay.
My practice was being able to get up and move and go out in a sense of defiance, but in a space that I couldn't have been around other people in that same way. I think that's what helped me push on to that, just kind of being in my own body and in my thoughts away from the work for a moment to come back. But yeah, I was very much an open channel for years. That is work that is necessary. I think you're right. In a lot of ways, it is a sacrifice, but that's work that was necessary for me, particularly because no one else was doing it at the time, but also because that's what I felt called to. I couldn't figure out any other way other than that. So I knew that it was something that I was supposed to be doing. And I knew that if I'm supposed to be doing it, I will survive whatever was happening with it. And then, now in a very different space because it became the work that was the basis of my dissertation and all of that. I tarried with that from 2020 to 2025. So 5 years worth of really being in that in an embodied way and then in a more what felt like a clinical way until I merged them back again. And now I think what's beautiful, I'm so far out of survival mode now that I get to figure out what can sustain me in ways that don't have to be triage, right? Sometimes we have mechanisms of sustainability that are triage focused, right? It's
Yeah.
how we survive. So walking was how I survived. Doing physical theater when we could get back around people was how I survived in a lot of ways, having that. But now that I get to live, it's about, okay, how do I sustain living, not bringing my head above water? How do I enjoy the swimming of it all? I'm trying to find that. I came back to Tai Chi because I encountered it in college and then I went back to it and it felt good for a second. And then I'm like, oh, I don't think that's right. I've been able to do this practice of let me find a hobby and see if it hits for me. Let me find that to work. And it's, necessarily something different than the labor of work that I do. For me, though poetry is the way that I think and move in that way, poetry is not a practice for me that is calming, right? Poetry is not sustaining for me. It is a necessary labor, but in a way that is good that I have to do. But poetry, it takes something, right? So it is my responsibility to then refill that up so I can keep doing that work
Yes.
in that way.
Yes. Yes.
But it does take something because it requires a lot of not just emotional vulnerability, but when I write, I sit and kind of just feel like it's very visual for me, but I exist in the space in between
Yes.
all of it. So everything that could be channeled is flowing through me, around me. I'm catching and I'm synthesizing and pushing and moving, and all of that is just emotional rawness and trying to find a way to talk about something that we, as people in our everyday lives are forced to believe that, oh, we have to minimize our speech, right? But if I'm trying to talk about love, well, I'm talking about primordial wind, right? And air, because that's how it feels. And that, even in that kind of space, is a huge, intense feeling that takes a toll on your body.
So,
So yeah, I'm trying to find the different ways to negotiate that now more so as I'm no longer writing from survival. And this work is different now because there's part of me that I think will still continue in some of this particular kind of work of being open channel. But I think there's another version of this, that there's a next step of it that I'm trying to suss out. And we have now created the infrastructure for joy in life. How do we then build that even more? Because I don't think my body can take 5 years of being a channel in that way of grief and pain specifically anymore. So then how do I continue this work, but in a way that's more sustainable? And there's a joy in figuring that out. And I get to be able to say I am figuring it out now instead of it'll happen. God got it or whatever.
right,
Like,
right, right. And God might have it, but you have it.
exactly.
And my goodness, I was sitting here listening to you and thinking, you have to follow the spirit. And there was a reason why I didn't open up the podcast with a poem. And now I know why. Because I really want folks to not just hear a poem, but to really have a fundamental understanding of what poetry does and can do. And for me, I write poetry to heal myself. I write to free and heal myself. And it is labor. And I want to share, I know we're supposed to be talking about Archaeology of the Self book, but it's all connected because the first chapter of the book is called Growing Up Bronx. And I talk
Hmm.
about what it meant to grow up in the 1980s in the Bronx with a force-fed crack epidemic poured into my
Hmm.
community, as well as this amazing, explosive, never before ever matched um, creation of culture known as hip hop. Yes, you can say rock and roll, all these other amazing genres, but hip hop, and of course, its connection to the blues and to enslavement songs and all of these other traditions. And I'm there and it's exploding onto the scene at the very nascent, right? Not the
Hmm.
53-year or 55-year now cultural phenomenon we've known for it to be. So, a book that I'm writing now, my third poetry book, is called Growing Up Bronx.
Hmm.
And I'm writing, I feel in some ways channeling, yes, my own memories, but taking on the voices of others, interviewing my mother and my brother and my sister, and literally having their words and experiences be the poems in the book. And I have to tell you, after I finish writing some of these poems, I'm exhausted.
Hmm.
I'm exhausted because I feel the labor of the stories that are beckoning to be told. I just wanted to affirm that. I have one or two more questions before we get to our rapid reflection. In some ways, the work that you're doing is still very, very demanding, from my understanding, because you're taking on oppression, you're taking on
Hmm.
anti Blackness, you're taking on the violence to queer bodies and helping to pull others along. I want to take that and match it a bit with the work that you've been doing with Dr. Cynthia Dillard under
Hmm.
the title of Beloved Community. right?
Mm-hmm.
So in anti-oppressive teaching and language, this language is never small, right? But what are the everyday, let's say, micro artifacts, names, pronouns, participation norms, discipline that either reproduce domination or build a beloved community? One other thing I wanted to say is wherever you are going, yes, you were saying what's next, we know it will be multidisciplinary. We know it will be multimodal. We know it will be beautiful. And so anything that comes out of your mouth right now will be exactly what we need to hear.
Thank you. And thank you for making the link to this work. It's always there, but making it apparent is always lovely. It's been a joy to be a part of this kind of work with Dr. Cynthia Dillard and the entire team that we have in really situating beloved community. And for many people, that means different things. And what we've been trying to do, even as a research team, even a little bit removed from the participants, right? It's like, what is beloved community to us as the people who are foregrounding this particular version of this framework? For me, beloved community, we all talk about the elements of beloved community, right? And we have many, and they're growing at this point. But my favorite element, I think we all have our favorites. My favorite is accountability.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we cannot be accountable to each other, we cannot be in community. Because the community, the maintenance of that is about accountability. I not only have to be able to depend on you or to count on you, but I also have to know that when you do wrong, you can accept the correction and how to do right and do better, right? I've said this for years. I don't know where I got it from. Maybe it came from the spirit, but better is not who you are, it's the thing that you do, right? We consistently better ourselves. And it's not toward perfection, but it's becoming the best version of you as possible. And for me, accountability works within that. So when I think of the everyday artifacts, or I'll call them like the exquisite quotidians, right? That's how I frame them in my work. It's little things like that. And in this project, we work with these schools all across Washington State. And in the most grand scheme of things, we're helping them develop a framework to go into their current workings and restitch and reconstruct from these things that seem reasonable to us when we are in conversation, but very hard to do. It's easy to talk about vulnerability, but it's hard to be vulnerable, right? And it's hard to wrap vulnerability into the everyday fabric of how we move, right? Which moves into the everyday things of like, how do we speak to each other? How do we say hello in a hallway? And thinking of a K through 12 school, how do I greet students? How do I greet teachers who are like me, leaders who are like me? What do I say? Is it just a, hey, how are you doing? Or is it, how is your spirit? Like, how are you feeling today? And then waiting for the answer, right? It's a very emergent kind of theory strategy. But when you push these small acts together, they create not only a language of love or a lexicon of love, it creates an environment that's filled and foundationalized with that, right? One of the beautiful things about negotiating things at a school is that you get people who are in their formative space. And if you can get that ground in them, they take that with them wherever they go. And we know that because we take a lot of the violence, we take a lot of the oppression, we take a lot of the awfulness with us as we go. And that gets stuck into us. And then it becomes things that we have to unlearn. But the beauty about this kind of work that just sits with me is this question of what if we get it right? What if we are able to give this to young people so that they don't have to unlearn the same things that we had to unlearn and that we still continuously have to unlearn? What if we get it right? And that's what beloved community in this context feels like to me. So those artifacts, those little things can be as complicated as curriculum change, or we say it's as complicated as curriculum change, right? But really it's how do you as a student or you as a teacher or you as a leader, how does your positionality where you come from matter in the context of the stuff that we're learning, right? It could just be like, how do you matter? Which then turns into, well, we are in Washington State, we're in Seattle. Maybe we should have some more pieces in our curriculum that open it so that students can talk about who they are and where they come from.
Yeah.
Maybe it could be, let's actively bring in folks from many of the indigenous communities and cultures around to talk about the history of this land and this space in a way that is relatively easy to actually do. But the systems of oppression that are racked within the education system prevent us from being able to even dream of that possibility. I love that you said everyday artifacts because that's a lovely way to think about it and for us to really instill. But it's taking it from a building block perspective of how do you build this brick by brick? And then what are those bricks, right? Those bricks are accountability. Those bricks are consent, right? Because you have to consent to be in community with people. You can't force anybody to stay in community with you, nor can you force anybody to be in community with you. So consent means I say I would like to join, but I could also say I no longer want to be here because it's not serving me. That kind of liberation and agency and potential freedom is fascinating in a system that is inherently carceral and in a system that is inherently oppressive, which is what the traditional education system in the United States is. We've all riffed off of that and made more liberative spaces and different ways of moving, but the base system itself is one that funnels, people who look like us into prison or into industry or into like industrialization or into those kind of high capitalistic spaces. It's really trying to figure out what are the small acts of love that aren't actually that small. See, now as we're talking, you got me thinking in a very different way. But I wonder if that's the issue is that we consistently think of things as small sometimes. And somebody showing you care or love in the smallest way can save your life. So I don't actually think that it's small. I think that we've been taught to think of love as small.
Definitely in quotations.
Yeah. Small in quotation, right? Not like acts that don't have to be huge, but we think of it as this is less important than, right? Small in the size comparison space. This kind of work is beautiful, but the real everyday is really about how do we process that transformation every day. I hope that answered.
Oh my gosh. And then
But,
some. I just want to tell you before we get to rapid
mhm.
reflection, what ease you bring to my soul. Just this conversation is such a calming, easeful feeling in my body. My brain is activated, but in an easy, challenging, beautiful way. And I just want to thank you. I'm sitting here thinking, well, I cannot wait to read that book. And I cannot wait to see that rendering in a painting. And I cannot wait to see that play. Because truly, truly, as you speak, as you share, it is in a multimodal, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary way. That teacher got it right. She saw something in Edgar Allan Poe, whatever the channel, the Civil War poems, she knew that there was something different, something deep about you in fourth grade that she handed you that book. Here's the thing, it's a beautiful thing that you were in that space to respond, that you were in that space too, because you could have scoffed. Why does Lady
Mhm.
giving me this book? But part of your journey was to receive, receive, receive. And oh my goodness, what you've done and how you've given to us. Exquisite quotidians, artifacts. You ready for some rapid reflection?
Let's go.
Let's go. In one word, excavation is.
Liberation.
In one word, beloved community feels like.
Freedom. That's the first one that came up.
And what's the second?
Cookout. you know?
Come on. Okay, finish this sentence. A classroom practice I consider non negotiable for justice is.
Hmm. Community guidelines.
I was going to say love. Beloved connected to community. Beloved community.
Hmm.
Okay, one word. The biggest artifact educators ignore is.
Themselves.
Well,
Their own personal history.
analogy of the South come through. Okay. Finish the sentence. When I'm facilitating and I sense harm, my first move is.
to pause. To take a breath.
One word. A truth I had to unlearn to become a more liberatory educator is.
Hmm. This is one concept. I don't know if it can be one word, but that we can actually dream things into reality, that we're not bound by that. Yeah.
Listen, this could be whatever you want. And I am so grateful for everything that comes out of your mouth. And I mean that. I mean that sincerely. Okay, almost done. What's one way you see oppression map onto the body in learning spaces? And what's one way you interrupt?
Yeah, this is a big one. So our bodies were the things that were held captive. Our bodies were made capital. Our bodies were forced into labor. Oppression lives at the site of our bodies, right? It lives at embodiment. So something we think of as small as students walking in with their heads down or walking in a way that looks deeply uncomfortable is actually incredibly specific because they're walking in a way that is protective of their body because they're constantly having to fight for it. So how do we interrupt that? It's not just making a kid stand up straight or doing that. It's helping them to interrogate, hey, why is your body feeling like this? Where do you feel like actual pain? And I remember like being young and holding physical pain in my body and not understanding how to release that because we teach kids how to hold pain and what pain is, but we don't teach them what to release and how to release that, which is why we have so many issues in releasing that ourselves and releasing the tension later. That's one of the biggest things. One, to be able to notice that someone is not moving or they're moving with restriction or they're moving in a way that doesn't seem as liberative in their bodies as they can be, which is important for all kids, but especially important for young queer kids who what's policed most about us is why are you walking like that? Why are you talking like that? Why are you moving like that? Sit up straight, do this, do this, do this, right? Be a man, be a girl. And how do we interrupt that is inviting a possibility that it could look differently. Inviting the possibility of something else. Invite the possibility that you can sit how you actually normally want to
That's
sit.
great.
That you as a teacher, as an educator, can move the way you want to. Because young people take cues from us. So if they continue with restriction, it's because we're being restrictive of ourselves. And it's something that they smell fear. Like,
They
kids are wild. They know that. And we as adults do it too. We just ignore it. And what happens if we actually say, well, let me navigate this in myself. And also let me invite this space, even if you can't do it at home. This is what some of my the research in my dissertation was about. But if you can't do this at home, what if this is the most liberative physical space that you can have? I don't care how you move. I don't care how you get up. I don't care how that happens. It's not going to be disruptive. Just exist because that's the only way you're going to take in as much knowledge as you can.
My Lord. Before the last question, I just want to thank you for all of that, especially because that is the sentiment of the book. That in Archaeology of Self, I'm inviting educators to do that type of excavation, that type of deep work, so that they can free themselves, so that they can then create classrooms that are portals for freedom for their students.
Portals for freedom. I love that.
For freedom. We've got work to write together. You know that, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So here we go. Last rapid reflection in one word: joy in justice work is.
Hmm. This wraps back around to what you asked me, what's next, which is giving life back to the living dead, right? One of the reasons why that work was so important to me and what actually sustained me was that giving life back to other people taught me how to give life back to myself.
Mm.
Because we as Black people are made to feel as if we are living dead. We're socially dead in that way. So, in thinking about the justice of this, the love of this, the joy in this is what does it mean to give life back to people who thought that they weren't deserving of it, who thought that we couldn't have it? And how do we do that from a necrographic divinatory space? How do we learn more about living, and how do we actively practice that? And part of that is not just leaning into joy as the momentary, we think joy is quick happiness thing, but leaning into joy as a practice of living, not one of survival. Because I don't think that joy and survival can coexist sustainably. So it's a practice of like joy as living. What does that look and feel like in your body? And that's what I think all of the work I'm doing now really reflects. And that's where I think some of the particular interventions of all of the work that I have done before are moving fully toward, which is I have helped to navigate the dead, and now I have all of these ancestors who feel honored and honored enough to then help me help other people who are also living so that we don't have to learn that lesson after we die. So thank you for that question.
So thank you, because you definitely gave me life and joy on this episode. And if I'm not a betting woman, but if I had to bet, I bet the readers got some life and some joy. Thank you so, so much. And you are your name because indeed you are joy. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I love you, Dr. Joy Wright, and I'm grateful for this time. And
Thank you
thanks for
so
listening,
much.
everyone.
Thank you. Love you too.
Thank you so much for joining me on Dig Deep with Dr. Yolie. Until next time, stay curious, be gentle with yourself, and keep digging deep.